Let me welcome you all here. My name is Gunnar Knapp. I'm the director of ITER, and it's a real pleasure to have you all here. And I think since I don't recognize most of your faces, why don't we go briefly around the room and just learn who everybody is here, so that we all know who we are, and then we'll get started with our speaker. Just so what's your name and where are you from? Or
I'm Brian Kahn. I'm from Massachusetts.
Are you a student or are you?
Oh yeah, I'm a student at UA.
Okay,
obviously.
Great. Yeah. Okay.
James Shoemake, I'm a research professional here at ICER, and I did my master's thesis on hearing and tskah.
Eric Schacht, I'm a graduate student at UAF, but I'm also working for the Division of Subsistence.
Thanks.
I'm Josh Ream. I'm also at the Division of Subsistence and a grad student at UAF.
Dustin Murray, work for Subsistence, and I attend UAA.
I'm Anne, I'm a student at UA.
Stephanie, student at UA.
Desiree, student at UA.
My name is Boone. I attend UA.
Hi, I'm Courtney Carruthers. I'm a faculty at UAF. I'm based here in Anchorage, and this is little baby Sola. We've been hibernating, so it's good to see you guys.
My name is Esther Roll. I'm a student at UAA.
I'm Haley, and I'm a student at UA.
I'm Liza Mack. I'm a student at UAF, Indigenous Studies PhD program and a basis fellow.
I'm Ben Williams. I'm a graduate student at UAF.
I'm Sally Carraher. I'm faculty in the anthropology department.
And I'm Kristen Ogilvie. I work for the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation and also adjunct faculty in the anthropology department.
I'm Yoko Kubo. I'm a graduate student at UAA in anthropology.
Thanks everybody for coming, and with no further ado, Barry.
I might wear glasses. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to present for your invitation. I'd like to recognize that we stand on indigenous land and to express my appreciation for those people whose lands we are on. So I'm talking about herring today. And I was actually glancing at the picture that I'd scanned into my computer. But my first memory of herring is seeing a photo of my infant self when I was maybe not much older than Courtney's little one. And my father was holding me in his arms as he stood on the Dodger, the wheelhouse of the Silver Bounty, which had a deck load of herring on it. This 70-foot-long seine boat was plugged to the gunnels with fish. My father fished on a reduction herring boat during the 1960s, and these large boats would use seine nets to catch herring, from which was produced animal feed and fertilizer. Really hard to imagine such a waste of such a good fish. While it wasn't good living for a young fisherman with a family, it was devastating to the coastal herring stocks, which collapsed by the end of the 1960s in British Columbia. A good friend of my father's and fellow fisherman, the late George Woods, described the devastating effects of the reduction herring fishery in this way, and I quote, "I joined the reduction herring fishery near the end of its time, and fished for the last 5 years that fishing was open. The reduction herring fishery was eventually shut down on the coast because it nearly wiped out the herring stocks in British Columbia. Part of the reason for the herring collapse at the time was that we used lights to fish for the herring. We would harvest whatever the boat could hold. I personally saw hundreds and hundreds of tons of herring pulled from the waters during the reduction fishery." Like my father, George Woods fished on boats that were affiliated to Prince Rupert Fishermen's Co-op. And I myself had first met George when he was a crew member on a boat called the Brooks Bay, which was skippered by a guy called Tommy Mosley, in the late 1970s, when I was a young man working on my dad's own boat. Later, when I was doing research in Lachlan, the home village of Gitga'ala, I had many opportunities to speak with George informally and on occasion to conduct formal interviews with him about his life in BC's commercial fishery. I always like to think about how and I marvel in a kind of dual sense at the 10,000 plus tons a year the pool of 4 seine boats that my father was a participant in caught each year through most of the 1960s. 10,000 tons. I think the commercial herring roe fishery in BC is around 30,000 tons max these days, and that's a challenge number. My father described to me an amazing variation of herring from inlet to inlet, cove to cove. In some locations, the fish were all larger. In some, they were mixed size. Some, they were small. The sheen of the fish was different from place to place, he would tell me. And because they're fishing in the winter herring in these different places, so they start from about after you finish halibut, because they also fished what we call westward, off of Yakutat and up into the Aleutians for all the summer months. And then starting around October, they started the reduction fishery. Some of the fish was oilier, some was drier. The common theme was that they loaded their boats as much as they could and took it to port where it was reduced animal feed. And just the other day, chatting with my dad, telling him what I was doing, he started telling me about a load of fish they had to run from basically just north of Vancouver up to Prince Rupert to offload. And a story of sitting on a cork line, you know, the lead cork line, as they're saying, holding it up for the packer to arrive for 3 days. Can you imagine sitting with a load of herring in your seine for 3 days waiting for your packer to turn up? It's an interesting thought. Indigenous people have harvested herring for thousands of years prior to the industrial herring fishery. In our archaeological research, which we've been doing on Kakatla territory, we have found herring to be as important a constituent of the faunal assemblage as is salmon. Some of you might be familiar with a paper that recently came out with Dan Lipovsky, Ian McKechnie, I think Madonna Moss, a couple others, where they document archaeological findings to show this. The research in Kakatla territory hasn't been included in those because it's relatively new work, but our results are totally consistent with what they've been finding. For archaeologists and contemporary Kakatla harvesters alike, this has been a surprising result, finding all this herring in the faunal assemblages. Yet, if we look back to the pre-reduction herring fishery era, we note the ubiquitous presence of herring, and if we pay attention to the historical documents and oral accounts, we should not really be surprised. This presentation explores the importance of herring for Kakatla yesterday and today and examines what I find an intriguing and at times perplexing narrowing of utilization of this fish that has occurred with the arrival of the European economy in our waters. Historical accounts clearly document the harvesting of herring throughout British Columbian waters. Early travelers included reference to herring, among other fish, being dried and smoked. Franz Boas's famous accounts of the Kwakwaka'wakw, for example, describe in fine detail the range of harvesting and processing techniques. Ian McKechnie, who has just completed his doctorate, an archaeological doctorate at UBC, showed me a picture from one of the early explorers from the west coast of Vancouver Island of a painting, sketching it inside a house. And when you actually start looking at the fish that are hanging all over this large plank house, herring. And that's quite, I think, because normally we think of our coast as being salmon people, but herring is quite prominent. Herring was harvested by use of both passive and active gear. Intertidal stone traps were built along shorelines herring frequented during spawning season. And then using the behavior of the fish, because herring, of course, is a schooling fish, hundreds, if not thousands of tons will congregate in one school. Using the action of the tide, these stone traps would create the conditions to trap fish for harvest. We've actually mapped, and through using the surveying technology and three-dimensional dynamics, the different traps. And some we realized, which initially have been thought to be salmon traps, just really can't possibly really be salmon traps. They must, I'm pretty sure, are herring traps or some similar type of fish, given their location and placement. It does await further work to substantiate that, but that's my gut feeling. Active gears for herring included a rake-like device that was armed with sharp teeth. Fishers using this method would maneuver the canoes over top of a school and then rake the herring, pulling it into the canoe, shaking them off into the boat. The herring was processed, drying, smoking, rendering into oil. Fresh herring were strung through the gills on prepared cedar skewers, a couple feet in length, in groups of 50 to 100 fish. These fish-laden skewers were then hung in the rafters of a longhouse to dry or processed in a specially built smokehouse. Once either dried or smoked, the fish were then packaged in bedwood boxes for long-term storage. Herring processed in this manner was used as a household food item and as a commodity for trade and exchange. The method for rendering herring into oil is similar to that used to produce silicone grease. After capture, the herring were stored in large wooden containers. They were allowed to ripen for a period of several days or weeks. Once ripe, the fish were boiled in large open containers. The oil was floated off the surface of the water. The resultant fish oil was then stored in special wooden boxes and consumed as a household food item or traded in regional networks of trade and exchange. Herring roe was and remains a food item harvested for household consumption and trade. I know back home the roe and kelp commercial fishery and the roe and branches, xs'waanx and leggy type herring harvests are about to begin. And I understand, I think on this coast, I think I heard reports, and you guys might even be talking about tskah. So we're right in the moment of this. But the harvest of roe here, particularly the work group would first collect the hemlock branches or even entire small trees. Once collected, it would be secured along the shoreline in anticipation of the spawning herring, which starts from about now through to May. A second form of herring roe is harvested. This is what we call leggy. It's a variant of spawn on seaweed. This variant is picked at low tide after the herring has spawned. Leggy is what's basically it's a spawn on a kind of seaweed that looks like branches. I don't know its actual scientific name. My apologies. I should have actually checked into it. I only know its traditional name. This is a variant of spawn. Okay, I said that. This variant is. Oh, I said that too. Well, most herring roe is harvested today from Kakatla Inlet, which is right near the main village of Lac Plan. In years past, roe and herring were harvested throughout Lac Kakatla. And you hear the accounts and people talking about where one went, how one went there, and oftentimes the processing and harvesting of herring is tied to a range of activities. Now, one would focus on harvesting, but there's these multi-purpose sites that exist without the territory, and herring was one of the central resources at each of these different sites. Especially outer coast sites where you'd be harvesting seaweed, halibut, as well as herring around this time of year. And if you're a little bit later in some of the later run spawns, because there's different sequences of spawns, which we don't have the same. They've been concentrated into a shorter period of time due to the effects of the commercial harvest over the last century or so. Some of them even correspond with some of the birds' egg picking places and things like that. Herring roe itself is processed to store by drying, and in the case of roe and hemlock, the branches are removed from the water once an appropriate layer of spawn is collected. And then on shore, the branches are taken, are cut into smaller lengths, which are then hung to air dry. Once dried, the roe is carefully removed from the branches and in the past was packed in bentwood boxes, but today people often use plastic bags and freeze the dry roe to store for future use. There's nothing to say that we don't take advantage of contemporary advances in technology. Leggy is dried and stored in much the same manner. Now, for a millennia prior to arrival of Europeans, herring was harvested for roe and the fish itself. From our archaeological research, we can document very clearly the importance of herring in the recovered faunal assemblage. Now, we started an archaeological project in 2008 with the objective of mapping and recording intertidal fish traps. One of the reasons we started doing this is that we're facing the exportation of tar sand oil through our territory in large vessels. Our community is currently in court trying to have this stopped. But one of the reasons to propel this project is in reading some of the preparatory government literature, came across an archaeological survey that said there are no significant archaeological sites in Kakatla territory within 20 meters of the intertidal zone. And it was a bit of a shock to everyone who sat down and read that document. But technically speaking, the government report was correct because there are no archaeological sites recorded. Well, let me rephrase that. Because there aren't very many archaeological sites recording Kakatla territory, because it's bloody hard to get to. Because the way archaeology is funded and organized, most of the archaeological projects happen in Prince Edward Harbor, because it's got a railway and a highway. Happen in the Queen Charlotte Islands, Haida Gwaii, in result of the park that was built there and the issues of logging conflicts in the 70s and leading to the 80s. So that created a political desire to do the work. Namu in the central coast of BC. Big fish plant storage, used to have major communications networks through there. Also meant you could stay in the cannery bunkhouse and then do your archaeological digs right by the side. So you had a logistics center. There's new work now happening in the Central Coast because there's a retired computer software built multi-billionaire who's bought himself a fish lodge and is now funding researchers to do studies there. So these kind of interesting things structure how research gets done. Nothing happened in Kaka'ala territory. Well, pardon me, Philip Drucker was there in 1938, did an excavation. Bjorn Simonson, with the help of community members from Hartley Bay and adjoining Tsimshian community, passed through the area and did a coastal survey, very briefly, about 10 days. So nothing was basically done. So our work, so that propelled us to do this work because my colleagues like to point out I'm not officially an archaeologist. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. But I've met many archaeologists, and if there is archaeologists here, I'm going to apologize when I say this. Archaeologists are always becoming ethnographers, and they seem to be really easy to do. And since they can become an ethnographer, I just don't see why I can't become an archaeologist. You lay down a grid and you put a hole. It's not really that true. That's true. It's a little more complex. I shouldn't be so tongue-in-cheek about it, but. So as we started to develop, we started to expand our scope of research to include a set of non-invasive archaeological techniques where we used systematic soil sampling by an auger. It's like a fence post hole digger, and we take about a liter of sample every 30 centimeters, and we go down. Our effective depth with an auger, before we start losing the bucket, the bottom, is about 4.5 to 5 meters, depending upon the type of soil we're in. A really loose, unconsolidated clamshell, we get stuck at around 3.5 to 4 meters. Really, really hard, packed, sort of crunched muscle shell type midden base. It's really hard. We can get down about 5.5 meters, but we really need to have a crew with heavy upper body to move the auger because it's all human labor power. We also used a percussion coring device used for soil sampling, which I picked up from my colleagues, and we go beyond its technical capacity. Actually, these things aren't really designed to go down to 6 or 7 meters, and you get one sort of a little tube about that thick. But we do it because it gives us the basal depths, and we get a date from, and to have. It's interesting sometimes getting these technical machines out, but what we've been able to do is to document the deep history of Kaka'ala harvest practices as a complement to contemporary and recent historical knowledge provided by community resource harvesters and elders. Now, the percussion coring, as I mentioned, allows us to determine the depth of the anthropogenic soils at the place of our research. From the cores, we can also ascertain whether the place has been lived in without interruption or not, which is a big deal in terms of legal issues and things like that. But it's really impressive. 4,000 to 5,000 years continuous habitation in these communities to a letter. Imagine that, and of course, that old date, that's sea level stabilization in our part of the coast. So that's not how long people are there. That's just the date that we can actually determine the most recent date because the sea levels have been bouncing up and down due to the post-glacial rebound, etc. We've also done a couple of household hearth excavations, just a meter by meter by meter, to give us a sense of the use, and that brings us down to about 2,000 years in one place, about 1,800, it's about 2,000 years or so. And that allows us to give a very fine-grained analysis of food processing. The augers have been our primary technique for developing a systematic understanding of Kaka'ala's ancient harvesting practices. And with the auger, we're able to collect soil samples from the surface to the bottom of the anthropogenic soils, to the limits I mentioned previously. And using this approach, we can provide a fairly detailed account of the faunal materials deposited at each place we visit. Doing all of this has provided us with a very detailed account of the wide diversity of animals harvested over time. Most significant to me is the consistency of harvest at each location over multiple millennia. This requires some further, the more statistical, detailed type of analysis, not the descriptive statistics about percentage of this and that, but actually looking at the variations between the different numbers so we can see if the kind of observational data, conclusions are correct. But it really strikes me as an really insanely consistent harvest over millennia. And that says something about human practice and behavior. It potentially gives us clues about the nature of sustainability, the biodiversity. Depends, of course, upon population dynamics, human population dynamics. When you start adding up the number of village sites that have been occupied contiguously, consistently, historically for a long time in one place, and adjoining others, and you start calculating the number of house depressions and sizes, and then you realize that these houses often are in place for 500 to 700 to 1,000 years, and typically just get rebuilt in location. And so that kind of stability tells you that I think our population estimates of pre-arrival, European arrival estimates are really out of whack and low. So that then has implications in terms of harvest levels and human impacts. But we can say more about that in questions. Within archaeology, one of the standard measures used is something called NISP, number of individual specimens that turn up in your sample. It's presented as a percentage to allow for comparison of relative abundance of a particular species within the context of a specific sample or archaeological site. It's important to point out that NISP is not a measure of abundance of a species or a measure of the actual harvest level. It's really it's a measure of abundance relative to our sample of soil. We can infer things. I mean, you can take some sort of very interesting explanations when we are sort of extrapolations. Because when you use the three-dimensional surveying tools to measure sites, and then you map in your depths, you can start calculating your overall volume of anthropogenic soil placed into a village. And then you can, by averaging and comparing, it's rough, there's all kinds of error creeps in with each one of these kind of extrapolations. You can start figuring out how many bones you can sort of project, fish bones, throughout that entire site. And you're talking large volumes. So I'm not going to give you a number. I'm going to give you a qualitative assessment, large number. But by all accounts, it's a lot of stuff that's turning up there. My archaeology colleagues would be really upset with that quantitative analysis. But I'm going to sort of go with it anyway. I mean, the key thing that we're looking at is that this measure of NISP tells us simply that a species was present in its relative quantity in relation to other species identified in a sample. And this is kind of important, and it's one of the kind of keystone numbers that the archaeologists use. So the NISP of salmon, herring, and greenling for 9 of the Kakatla places that we have worked at since 2009 shows that herring is as important, if not more so, than the culturally iconic salmon. Our data also allows us to talk about the seasonality of use. Herring is typically a spring fishery and salmon a summer or fall fishery, and then we can take a look at regional networks of exchange. For our purposes here, I'm just going to look at the data points that you think about the whole herring, the use of whole herring by Kakatla. And so what it shows is herring wasn't simply a roe fish that was harvested. It was the whole fish, and it's turning up because we're actually sieving our soil samples with a 1 millimeter mesh to get the herring bones. When I say we, I'm doing that classic faculty member thing. I mean my graduate students. My eyes, aren't good enough to see the herring vertebrae, which turn up like crazy, and which they count them all. Some of these place names won't mean anything to you, but so I'm not going to go over the place names. But basically, we're seeing herring, and some of the places like the other coast where these stone traps that we thought initially were salmon traps. We're seeing the herring percentage NISP at 55 to 70% in the samples compared to salmon, which are low, but pretty well we have if you were to say the two most prominent fish are salmon and herring, and that constitutes close to 80% of the fish in our faunal assemblages from these villages. But you see, but now there's a problem though, and I think this is a puzzle and that needs to be thought about just why. And I don't think to say when people stop doing it is not sufficient. We need to try and say what are the factors that go into play here. So, and it is important to recognize that herring is not alone among traditional Kakatla food items that have seen change patterns of utilization. Some foods are no longer used. New items have been added. Some of these new foods, like sugar, flour, and rice, have quite deleterious health effects. And then long-standing food items are today more likely to be fried than as they were in the past boiled or baked or dried. Changing foodways are part of all cultures. It's undeniable. Understanding how and why a specific change in taste or practices has occurred at a specific location at a particular moment in time, I think is critically important. Some changes are merely shifts in fashion. Other changes in taste can tell us about the structural alterations or disruptions. Changes in utilization of herring, I think, provides an avenue toward understanding a structural change in Kakatla society induced by incorporation within a global capitalist economy. So herring is, and I think I can say this, but some people might challenge me, but herring is a reasonably easy fish to catch, given harvesting gear utilized by Kakatla and the behavior of the fish. So you can, with reasonable labor expenditures, harvest relatively large volumes of the fish in a constrained period of time. It is, however, a fish that required a relatively high intensity of labor power to harvest usable quantities. So you need a good chunk of labor to be involved in this. Some of the salmon traps required less labor power per unit of fish harvested than it seems to me herring did. So when you compare it to salmon and halibut, two other important fish, herring required a lot more effort per unit harvested than either of these other two species. Said differently, less effort catches more salmon or more halibut using traditional fishing gears. This point is critical, I think, when one considers the human implications of the initial contact with European travelers. As Robert Boyd documents in chilling detail in his book, A Spirit of Pestilence, European contact brought with it a pathnogenic tidal wave of death. From the mid-1700s through to the early 1900s, waves of smallpox, measles, and influenza swept along the coast. These waves of death disrupted and cataclysmically destroyed social relationships and human communities. Kakatla oral history has several accounts of having to resort to mass graves to cope with the large numbers of deaths in some of the outlying villages. Early ship's logs, in particular that of Charles Bishop on the sailing vessel the Ruby, documents the spread and impact of the disease circa 1795. Quote, in the afternoon, sheikhs, xs'waanx is his name, xs'waanx in a large canoe paddled by 20 men with 2 wives, his son, and several other chiefs, attended by 2 large canoes full of armored men, and the canoe which had been with us in the morning came paddling down to the ship, singing with great melody. Sheikhs appeared to be about 40 years of age and was a respectable figure, but for the smallpox with which he was covered, though it appeared to be in the latest stage of the disorder, rendering him a piteous object. End quote. A month later, Captain Bishop again visits with xs'waanx. Bishop comments that, quote, the smallpox is raging among them, and although xs'waanx is quite recovered, yet his family are much affected by it, and he has buried one of his wives lately. His eldest and favorite son is now ill of this terrible disease, end quote. Disease was spread not simply by the accident of contact. In 1862, local officials in Victoria forcibly evicted indigenous people from the town sites when smallpox broke out. And this is well documented, and it's actually justified in the local media at times to prevent contagion spreading through the European settlement. The spread of smallpox from this one event had a devastating effect in coastal communities who had already been weakened by nearly a century of foreign diseases. Kakatla's population had been devastated by earlier waves of disease and consisted of barely 1,000 people in 1862. This epidemic, however, killed about 2/3 of the people living in the coast at that time. So there's a whole sequence of these things Now, the impact of depopulation, large and catastrophic waves of death, cannot be ignored when one examines the shift in utilization of herring and other foodstuffs. This might sound rather clinical, but I think it's useful to think of it in these terms. Disease directly reduced the number of people available and capable of engaging in the processing of foods and the maintenance of Kakatla society. This was a common coastal experience in the northwest coast of North America. Now, I am uncertain as to whether this is an irony or paradox. It is at the very least a tragedy. With the devastation of disease also came new economic opportunities. So the very sailors who brought smallpox into Kakatla homes were also seeking out furs in commercial trade. Kakatla was not alone in meeting these new opportunities by redeploying the labor power remaining into economically viable pursuits. So people faced with dire situations try to make as rational a decision as possible given the circumstances that they're confronting. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, these changes involved deploying available labor into intensified community harvests of sea otters. With the extirpation of sea otter, labor was again redeployed to intensify the harvest of seals. Then again, toward the late 1880s, the rise in the industrial salmon canning fishery, labor was redeployed to expand harvesting effort in salmon fisheries. Throughout all of this, the harvesting of herring shifted from a broad-based utilization that involved oil, flesh, and roe to a narrowly focused fishery targeting only the harvest of roe. The transition to a roe-centric harvest arose as a combination of reduced availability of labor, changing market opportunities, and the comparative value of roe flesh of herring in relation to other possible foodstuffs. As described previously, harvesting herring for the flesh is a labor-intensive practice. Herring roe is nutrient-rich and relatively easily harvested food item. In the face of labor shortages, strategic decisions were required. These conditions, combined with the new market opportunities, underlie, I think, a shift from a broad-based to narrow utilization of herring. The transition was not immediate. However, it would appear that by the late 1800s, herring was only being harvested by Kakatla as roe on an annual basis from April to May. Oral histories of resource harvest through the 20th century present the harvesting of herring roe xs'waanx as one of the normal and important sets of activities practiced at spring seaweed camps. Herring roe is further referenced as a critical object of trade within Kakatla, but more importantly with upriver indigenous communities. Herring roe for things like moose meat and soapberries. Well, actually herring roe, seaweed, and abalone, to be honest, being traded up the chain. Ben Hill, an elder and hereditary chief, who spent his childhood at springs at drag seine and seaweed camps on the west coast of Banks Island in the mid-1900s, described how his family would dry roe at their camps. Matthew Hill, a chief from the Eagle clan, spent his childhood in the same area as Ben Hill, also describes harvesting herring roe prior to the start of salmon fishing, along with production of seaweed and fishing for halibut. Larry Bolton, the Gisbuwada or Blackfish chief, whose house territory is also on the west coast of Banks Island, this is on the outer coast of Kakatla territory, states that harvesting herring roe in his territory is important and is used to trade with people in the Naspa Ulukan Greece. The herring spawn, he notes, is also a time to hunt birds and ducks that are attracted to the spawn. Few of the harvesters I've spoken with over the past decades, except those like my father and George Woods, who fished for herring commercially, ever discussed fishing herring for food. When one spoke of herring, we were speaking of herring roe, xs'waanx, not the fish itself. Any public meal, luncheon, or feast in that clan is guaranteed to have herring roe on the table. Though the entire fish is no longer consumed fresh, dried, or smoked, herring roe remains a prized staple. Consumption, the act of harvesting, and preparing of xs'waanx is a practice integral to being Kakatla today. Herring roe is a prized trade good that brings cherished food such as ulukan grease or soapberries into the community, and like abalone and salmon, herring is a central fish in the life and culture of Kakatla. It has been so for millennia, and as long as external commercial operations, oil tankers, or other industrial developments are kept at bay, herring will remain a culturally integral food for millennia to come, and perhaps at some day we'll start eating the fish again. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I didn't mention, which I could have, the participation in the commercial fishery, but commercial roe fishery. But I thought that would have taken us well past the deadline, the timeline.
So is that community still occupied today, or is that?
Oh, Kekatla is in Kekatla. We like to say that it's the longest continuously inhabited community in the coast. Now, one always has to be cautious with statements like that. But it is clearly from the bottom of the village soil, where this human soil has got up to continuously inhabited. It's gone through different stages. I mean, at the mid-1800s, there was something like 15 large longhouses along the coast in the village, and it has always remained a central winter ceremonial location within the community. The Kekatla or clan is the remaining group, and there was actually somewhere in the 1800s, hereditary leadership came together and says we actually need to regroup, and so they basically brought everybody into the one village. So you have parallels, like on Mass and Skidegate, for example, and Haida Gwaii, where sort of people came together in two locations after the devastation of smallpox. Oh, Rachel.
What is the commercial herring fishery like on the North Coast, and is there any involvement with folks from Kekatla?
Today, the only people who are involved in commercial fishery have roe-on kelp licenses, and the Kekatla Nation has, I believe, 1 or 2 roe-on kelp licenses, and there remains only one community member who I believe has a commercial roe-on kelp. If you were to go back about 20 years, there was about 6 commercial herring seine licenses in the village, and about 20 salmon seine licenses. The various management plans for preserving the fisheries has actually exterminated indigenous presence in the fishery by removing the licenses. And it's a complex socioeconomic process that does that. But the net effect has been to basically remove Aboriginal participants at a higher rate than non-Aboriginal participants. Yeah. But there was a commercial fishery, I think they took maybe 500 or 600 tons out of Kekatla Inlet. And there also been a series of court cases and protests. Because the commercial fishery, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans decided to have fisheries on the west coast of Vancouver Island, on around Bella Bella on the central coast, and on the Queen Charlotte Islands or Haida Gwaii. I think they reached an agreement, an industry for Haida agreement not to fish in Haida Gwaii. The court gave an injunction to stop the fishery in the Nuu-chah-nulth territory on the west coast, and there was a protest on the fishery in the central coast, but it went ahead, but in an area outside of where the community was particularly concerned about in terms of their traditional roe fishery. The Port Simpson roe fishery, I think, is just wrapping up, or is just done now. And so I think the biggest one was in the north, around there was about 1,800 tons, but I think the overall quota is around, I think it's under 30,000 tons this year. But there's it's now so heavily regulated that it's in the sense that it's all by quota, and they limit the number of boats that go in, and they kind of pool and divide the catch. So it's quite different than when I was doing it, where we waited for the whistle to go, and then I ran the skiff, and as soon as the whistle went, you just slammed the skiff into reverse and pulled the net off the back of the boat.
Yeah, the Sitka version. That's the Sitka version. They've tried to go to equal quota in Sitka, and it's been fall tooth and nail every time it's come up.
Yeah.
Too much money.
There was a question somewhere down this. Yeah.
So your cores, are all the species that are in the core easily identifiable by sight, or have you done some genetic analysis?
We have to get an expert to do the bone analysis. So we do all the separation and pull it out. And so there's they're called Pacific Ident in Basin Victoria. Becky Wiggins is the person that's done most of our work. And actually, she's I think she's one of the co-authors on the paper with McKechnie and Lipovsky on that recent herring paper, because it's a real skill, and it's an art, and you need somebody who can actually identify. So we get it all by the sizes, and we separate out, here's the fish and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's where that goes to there, because it's quite something. McKechnie's interesting. His master's thesis, he studied to see how many samples do you need before you actually will not find any new species in a sample. Somewhere around 20,000 bones or something. I forget exactly. But he has a nice little chart and graph. So we could still identify more species. We could do more samples based upon his sort of predictions. We're kind of at where we've got about 2/3 of what so we're not at the total redundancy yet in terms of our sample size. So based upon his data, we're about 2/3. But in terms of identifying the most ubiquitous species, we have a sufficient data pool for that. But but even it's kind of neat. Occasionally we get scales, which are really kind of neat. Very rare, but we do occasionally get them. And I'm always suspicious about whether there's something that kind of, how do we get it?
What is the third species?
Greenling.
Greenling?
Yeah. So it's a big drop off. It's running under 10%. And some it's fewer. Though one of the villages that we did had basically no herring, but anchovy. A lot of salmon, about 1/3 anchovy, and this is off Grenville Channel, the head of an inlet, with a big 4 lakes. It's a major sockeye stream, and I mean, I kind of scratch my head thinking, why on earth is anchovy the biggest species there, and there's virtually no herring? And I did risk asking our identification person if she was really sure, because I think, but she said, yeah, she was sure. Yeah.
Charles, really interesting presentation. Thank you. Being Scandinavian, I just don't understand why the taste for herring isn't more widespread. In fact,
No sour cream.
Commercial fishermen in the Bering Sea, they regard it as bait.
Yeah.
They're so rich that we're not.
I mean, that is really great halibut bait. We always use it for halibut bait.
Yeah, but what I was wondering was, you have any indication from your research about historical booms and busts in the herring fishery? Because I know just from some of the work that I've done in the Aleutians, in oral histories done on Alaska Dutch Harbor, they talk about the elders in the early 70s talk about the big herring booms of the 30s is what they were remembering, in that just schools of fish that were miles and miles long, and an industry that actually saved them from declining fur industry at the time, and that they even had to import women from Scotland, the Scotch girls, the herring givers, to come in and process it, because they didn't have the local, I guess the cod fishermen in the area didn't really have that knowledge, but it just struck me as interesting that they could experience that kind of boom, and then for years and years, nothing.
Yeah, nothing quite parallel in that sense, but I mean, most of the contemporary harvesters and people ranging from, say, their 40s into the early 70s to talk to are always express a bit of surprise, and then say, well, of course it makes sense, we would have eaten that. But it's this kind of surprise thing, because it's not a topic of discussion about a food, and it's actually seen as, those Scandinavian homesteaders down in Una River are the ones who eat herring, and so there's a kind of interesting shift that's occurred in how these food tastes emerge. And of course, what's happening down in Una River, which is in Kinkatla territory, just a couple miles down, is that they're pickling herring. Right, doing food fish herring, pickling herring, and people don't mind. People will eat pickled herring, but it's not seen as a home food anymore. Yet the evidence is pretty clear that it was. And I, trying to puzzle this through and think about it, it's just struck me that when you start looking at the comparisons of what's going on and the real redeployment after the seals start to fall off and the change in the treaties and the regulations for hunting seals and the first seal harvest in the mid-late 1800s, the development of the salmon canning fishery, which really targeted sockeye, and just the number of sockeye streams and watersheds within Kekala territory. There's a high number, and most of the chiefly houses made sure that they control the sockeye streams. And some of these actually were licensed under the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for drag seining. So I think it really ties to, when you look at the minutes for the creating reserves, which side around these fishing streams, they're really linked to sockeye as a resource. And it's almost like that kind of redeployment. It still doesn't totally explain, but we have a whole range of other tastes disappearing, and there's a complete flattening. And I think things like the replacement of cheap starches, wheat flour, sugar, and rice coming in is actually sort of shifting. So a traditional dish back home now is boiled white rice, seaweed, and ulican grease, and maybe a jar of salmon on top of it. But I mean, rice has become a kind of mainstay food, and so when you take a look at the role of these different types of greases and different types of sugars coming into the diet, it has an impact on. And when you move cash to start replacing, if you have a lack of labor power, how you start to redeploy. And it seems consistent across the coast. I can't think of anyone either though people would still eat ulican, but even that sort of is, depending on where you are, smelt. So you go down Washington State off the coast, there's smelt fisheries. So there's that's kind of herring-like fish that's being eaten. Smelts, ulicans are eaten, but once you get up into, above that, there's no replacement, and I don't know if there's any smelt-like or herring-like fish being consumed whole in indigenous communities. In Alaska, are people doing it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Hooligan is...
Hooligan, but beyond hooligan is herring consumed. I don't know that, I think the roe, but...
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely down. I was just seeing the big pictures of roe on everybody's Facebook page.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
Not many people do whole herring here anymore that I know of. You still have some people, but when I was in Sitka, it was most people catch them for bait and take the eggs, and that's pretty much it.
Well, I used to live in Sitka, and I'm Japanese. People know Japanese people love herring. So when they get the fish, they brought them to me, and I eat it. And I noticed some people like it.
Yeah.
Some people still eat as like main sauce. They don't have fish, they don't have the food. They just go out and get the herring, maybe once, get like a couple of them, and then bring them back and eat. That's the everyday food. Not everybody, but some. I had one question about the herring stone meal. I don't know. I haven't seen it in Southeast when I lived, but I wonder how you can identify how archaeological sites. What's the main difference between the herring stone meals? Should be on the ocean, should be on the beach side.
Oh, like the stone traps in the local places? Yeah. Most of it's always hard to make a kind of generalization like this, but most of the stone traps that appear to be consistent with harvesting salmon are either immediately adjacent to, in, or in a creek system. And so we have this one. So they're either, and they're probably operate in conjunction with some kind of wood fencing. So it's not just the stones, but so far we haven't been able to find any rubbed off stakes or anything in association with the traps.
So what's by traps?
But stone traps, big stone walls. I mean, they can be about this high when you actually excavate around them to see where the bottom of the traps are, and then they've silted in. A lot of them because the changes that have happened. So once you then leave there, the strange. Now the question becomes, because some people further south are talking about clam gardens. utilizing walls set in a particular direction, which extend the beach. And this one particular sequence we've looked at, which is a longshore set of traps, it hasn't actually increased sedimentation behind them in the same way. So there's not a clam area. It doesn't appear to be that. They are at various levels of the tide, and so you can always say, well, is this because there's change in the shoreline and sea level, and so they have moved? But they're kind of laid out linearly, and it just, when you compare it, it's all just inferences. There's no direct proof. But when you take a look at the prevalence of herring as highly ubiquitous in this area, and you see this is a zone where people would fish for herring, collect herring, roe, etc. And some of the accounts where people are saying, well, I think I remember, of course that's not very helpful. I think I remember hearing about. That's a pretty weak link to go on. But it just seems to suggest that some of these traps, these structures, are part of a kind of a weir system. And then if you take a look at some of the type of weirs that were built in other parts of the world for catching herring-type fish, they seem to look similar. So as I said, there's no kind of hit the head on the nail kind of proof of it. It's all a kind of sequence of inferences that's what these traps are. There's a couple of weird ones too, some square ones that people suggested were for flatfish or flounder, things like that. I don't know, sometimes, who knows, maybe somebody just went out one day and decided to pile a bunch of rocks in a square pattern. Human beings, who knows? Sometimes I think my archaeological colleagues make too many interpretive leaps. Yeah. I'm doing that too. It should be fair.
Well, I'm interested in sort of the politics of what's surrounding what you're doing, because, as an education person, I understand what's been going on with the struggle for self-determination in education, and I know that BC's been really interesting in terms of a mix of having the Aboriginal Enhancements Bureau, having the more self-determination on the reserves than some of the other places, but also giant leaps backwards. Yeah. And so how is now this work that you're doing impacting that, and is it part of also this broader movement that, are the educational shifts, do you have health shifts, do you have health system shifts, and other things that are working together along with the work that you're talking about?
Part of what's driven or motivated this work, and it's being run through the Kitkatla's Environmental Monitoring Agency as the sort of guiding structure that we have in place. It's about attempting to assert the sovereignty and control, but to do so with the effective information and data to do that. So it's one part of a piece. So, there's a whole range of different aspects. There's the kind of pure science side of it, where it's really just kind of really neat. There's the political sovereignty issue, where it's an assertion of control, and so there's an attempt to say, if you want to do research, it has to be done in this particular way. And, so for example, there's all these environmental assessment processes that are underway. And so the Kitkatla says, any research that's going to be done, we want control of it. We will fulfill the requirements, but we want control of it, and so that's an important, where we actually own the data. And it's a different kind of dynamic, and it's part of, it doesn't always work, because when you're dealing with Shell, or you're dealing with Enbridge, or you're dealing with these large energy companies who want to put wind farms all over top of everything, they typically have a room this size of people who are the experts and lawyers who can come, and then you've got like one or two people sitting on this side that are in Kitkatla that are arguing, you need to listen to us, and then they can point out every single thing that's wrong with any of these kind of contentions, every single hole in the volleyball better be able to do it. There's 50 of them, and but so it's part of that. There's a whole range of different things. But it's a balancing between trying to do the science, doing the political publications side of things, the legal court actions, as well as trying to take control. And then at the same time, you're talking about, especially the on-reserve village community, having 80 to 90% unemployment. Most people who want to be employed leave the community because there aren't jobs that has an impact. So you constantly have internal dynamics that affect things, as well as large-scale proponents on the outside that will take advantage of every kind of sort of fracture or friction that they can find to try to ensure that their project goes forward. Even coming to community with all kinds of promises of money. Classic one. I mean, and you can't begrudge people who are living in a cash poor environment accepting money for something. It's just, I think there's something ethically wrong with that. But on the other hand, it's not my place to say people shouldn't accept money. I'm completely better off situated being a university professor with a pension plan compared to somebody who's living below poverty without even having the means to harvest one's own food. So it becomes really complicated. So the idea behind all these things is that to actually have not just the theoretical authority, but the actual capacity to control, make the decisions, and so that people can actually have a meaningful livelihood. And that kind of struggle happens on a whole range of different fronts. But there's a parallel with education. In an interesting way, some of those social service type provisions, when I say it that way, like education, healthcare, it's like the governments like to pass it over because they're high cost, low revenue generating.
Right.
Whereas things like oil and gas, mineral rights, water rights, wind power rights might be high investment costs, but there's a real high return possibility. So they don't want to relinquish those things. And that's the struggle that's underway.
I guess along the same lines, are there struggles within the community to sort of re-engage into some of the commercial fisheries and sort of is that seen as one of the options forward for the youth?
Because of the way that to get into the kind of mainstream commercial fishery, because of the capitalization of that fishery due to licensing and all the restricted licensing, the quota systems. I mean, to buy halibut quota is around $30 to $35 a pound to buy the quota, as well as buying the tab to put the quota on. And then if you're going to lease it, and my dad was quite pleased because halibut price was selling ex-vessel and Rupert around $8.50 to $9 a pound, which means his lease rent is going to go way up this year, and he's quite pleased with that. But for the rest of the people who want to fish that quota, it's hard. There is a kind of quote-unquote commercial fishery that exists operating out of open skiffs with outboard motors and things like that. But the problem with that is it's technically illegal. So it doesn't really exist. So you have this kind of contradiction because because this natural practice of harvesting and exchanging and trading, etc., has been criminalized. And so that has its own kind of deleterious effects in terms of how that changes behaviors and practices.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it seems like some of the work Rachel and I will be doing, some of the communities here, same situation, right? As you know, the quotas and permits, but communities are getting a little bit fed up with that. And I think there's some movement in Alaska coming for sort of, forceful re-engagement by the communities that are totally dependent on this. So I was just wondering if it's similar kind of momentum building in BC.
Yeah, it's pretty hard. There's a lot. It depends which community and which place. Like some of the communities, like around Alert Bay, and for example, and down in the central coast, southern coast of BC, have a long history of a lot more capital invested in their gear. I mean, they've been hit hard by the return, but they're still there. In fact, the single largest, individual boat owner is a First Nations gentleman called xs'waanx from Hartley Bay, or not Hartley Bay, Port Hardy rather, and he has a big fleet that everyone calls the Joy boats because they're all something Joy, Serena Joy, Nicola Joy, etc. He's a big capitalist. He's also a Seventh-day Adventist, doesn't fish on Saturdays. He's kind of like an interesting anomaly. But his community is employed a lot more because of his participation. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if the herring fishery is at all threatened by any of the big mines that are planned in northwest BC. I know that salmon fishermen in Alaska and tribal members are increasingly concerned about some of the transboundary mining. And I was just wondering if herring would be potentially affected by that, or is it just the salmon issue?
Yeah, the concerns around for the herring are more about things like oil spills with the transportation of the tar sands, which has been given conditional approval by the federal government's review board. And some of the coastal mines, but the coastal mines tend to be smaller scale. So like on Banks Island, there's a small, what you might almost call a mom and pop scale operation. I'm sure capital speak wise, it's not. But they've got like, it's a relatively small crew, and they're doing gold mining, but they're just, because the price of gold, they grind up the stone and centrifuge it out. And there's concerns about their drainage and stuff and things like that. But I haven't heard it in terms of the fishing that concerns linking those concerns. But the oil tankers are real concern. People just always point to the Exxon Valdez, and of course people say, oh well, we've come a long way since then. And I'm thinking, well, human beings are human beings.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the end of our official allotted hour. I'd like to encourage the discussion to go on as long as you and anybody else is up for it. But I'm sure some people have to get back to working. So thanks very much. Really appreciate you coming.